run an organization called Treasures. I founded it 20 years ago. We just celebrated our 20-year anniversary. Yay! 20 years is a long time to do anything, let alone engage in anti-trafficking work and work with survivors of trauma. And just to give you a brief overview of what we do at Treasures, we have three main areas of focus. The first is outreach. We do outreach to every single strip club in Los Angeles County. We also do outreach in HIV testing centers where people in porn are regularly testing. And the reason we're doing outreach into these areas of the commercial sex industry is that 70% of female trafficking victims are trafficked into the commercial sex industry, including legal forms of it. And then the other piece of what we do is care. And our care includes our mentoring program, and we are able to match survivors with peer mentors that we train and vet and equipped to be able to really walk alongside and just be a really supportive, healthy relationship in the lives of the women that reach out to us for help. This year, last year, we actually launched a coaching program that's an arm of our mentorship program called Design Your Destiny that was actually developed by two survivors who both came through Treasures. And they launched that for women who want to get even more equipped and are ready to kind of take their journey to the next level and want to become leaders in their own right. And we run 3 different support groups a week, 40 weeks out of the year, and one of them is a Bible study. Last year, we had the honor of providing care to 727 women, and we had about over 300 women attend our virtual support groups. Many of them are logging in from around the world. And we also were able to provide 107 women with emergency financial assistance because many of the women that we support are living in poverty, are experiencing homelessness or unstable housing, and so sometimes they're even just $300 away from homelessness. And if their car breaks down, they have to choose between paying their rent and getting their car fixed. But if they can't get their car fixed because public transportation in LA is not great, that could mean they lose their job. So we are able to step in those really urgent situations and be able to financially support so that they continue to move towards sustainability and permanent freedom from exploitation and trafficking. And so that's kind of what we do in a nutshell. And you know, Kelly and I have been talking about me coming and being here with you today for a number of months, and I have a whole PowerPoint planned, and we'll probably get to much of it. But last night, before I was going to bed and reviewing my notes, there was just something kind of like, I don't know, I felt like something was kind of missing, and then I woke up in the middle of the night, and I just really felt God putting it on my heart to share some things with you that I don't believe I've ever shared from a platform, so bear with me. And yeah, we're just gonna get on a journey together and see where it takes us. Is that okay? All right, don't be scared. All right, so the first time I ever shared my story was in the year 2001 or 2000, one or the other, in Mozambique, Africa, with Vanguard University. I ended up on a mission trip. This is after I left my exploiter. I was involved in pimp-controlled exploitation in strip clubs. And so I left my exploiter, I began following Jesus, and really went full throttle into this whole different life, different culture. I was not raised around Christians. I didn't know Christians growing up to my knowledge. And so it was a whole new world for me. And so I ended up in Mozambique on a mission trip. And everyone who went on that trip was told in advance, hey, just be prepared to share your testimony at some point. They did not know who they were dealing with, okay? They did not know. And so I ended up in the middle of the bush on this little excursion we had taken, and we kept stopping at trees, and each tree was like a church. And then we'd have a church service, and then one of the kids, we're 20-somethings, and one of the young people on the trip would then do a little message or share their testimony. And finally, we got to this one tree, and these people were dancing and singing, and the translator says, okay, Harmony, now will you share your testimony? Again, he had no idea he didn't know my story. And so I shared my story for the first time, absolutely trembling. And at the end, we did an altar call, and every single person there got on their knees and was asking for prayer and asking to receive Jesus. And I was so confused. And afterwards, I said to the translator, I said, what kind of church is it where nobody's saved? And he was like, Harmony, that wasn't a church, that was a bar, and they were drunk. So it was such foreshadowing for my life because God is taking me to some very unusual places. Strip clubs all around the world, red light districts all around the world, brothels, and so he started me off, on the right foot there. And what I discovered that day is the power of a story. And I discovered that we truly do overcome by the blood of the Lamb and the word of our testimony. And up until that point, I thought that my past was something that I was going to have to kind of compartmentalize and lock away in a closet somewhere so that I could, fit in with mainstream Christian culture, and that person was dead and she didn't exist anymore, and that part of me was going to stay hidden. I didn't know that God was actually going to use all that I had been through and my whole self and all of my experiences, and that I would be able to walk wholly and fully in front of you today without having to hide parts of myself. And it was super empowering. And it was really that trip and that experience that ultimately kind of started the snowball in the trajectory of me ultimately founding Treasures and doing work to support others. And I shared my story publicly for ever since then, pretty much. And over time, what happened, and back then, there was really this sense for me that people didn't want to hear stories like mine, that the church was kind of uncomfortable. They didn't really want to talk about it. And so the charge was, my story matters. All of our stories matter. We all have a story, and we need to be able to surrender our stories and allow God to use our stories because there are people who need to hear our stories. That was the charge, and that felt so empowering to me. And the anti-trafficking movement began to really gain momentum, and eventually it got to the point where what did they need to be able to propel forward? Survivor stories. They wanted to put a face to the issue. I get it. It makes sense. I did the same thing with my organization, only I was the face to the issue. And, I even at one point got trained in, how to share your testimony. Make sure you can summarize it in 3 minutes. Imagine you're on or 3 minutes or less. Imagine you're on an elevator with someone, and you have just a short bit of time to share your testimony. How can you summarize it very quickly for them? And what ended up happening is telling my story again and again and again and again and making it more palatable and fitting as much trauma as possible into the shortest period of time is that I just felt like I was regurgitating sound bites. And specifically, it was very complicated because I felt like my mother specifically was reduced to a sound bite in my story. And she was a whole human. And in 2019, two things happened. One, I sat down with one last journalist who drove me crazy. And she was like many journalists that I have sat with who was probing for the trauma because she wanted to get those sound bites to make her article really catchy for people so that they'd want to read. Forgive me for saying this and tell me if I can't say it in second service, but trauma porn, right? We use that term in anti-trafficking because that's sometimes what happens is people's story are treated like trauma porn. We want to just be entertained by what kind of level of trauma. And so I was sitting with a journalist who had this kind of mindset, and she was digging and asking inappropriate questions. And I was just getting so frustrated and feeling very disempowered in that moment. And because I create race, when I get upset and I have an experience that I feel like I could learn from, I create resources. So then I created a whole resource around, interviewing survivors effectively and helping other people. Anyways, I digress. So that happened, and then my mother died in 2019. She died of early onset dementia. She began experiencing dementia in her early 50s. And her life, honestly, was quite tragic. it was quite tragic. It didn't get summed up with a bow. There wasn't, it wasn't your fairy tale ending. I watched this woman who herself had gone through severe trauma and did not have the tools and the resources to overcome that trauma, and was dealt with addiction, and her whole life was consumed by unresolved trauma and addiction. And ultimately, I believe that's part of what, led to the early onset of dementia for her. And she died in 2019 at the age of 65 of dementia. And that was really hard, because now I'm still being asked for these interviews, and I'm still being asked to tell my story. And I just couldn't do that to my mom anymore, because, like I said, she was a whole person. And so I have struggled since 2019 to find a way to tell my story that feels empowering to me and ethical. And at the end of the day, it's my story, right? I've surrendered it to God, but it's my story, and I think that I needed to go through a process of taking it back. And I'm going to share some of it with you today. But really, my story starts with my mom, and it starts with her story, because what we're talking about is very generational. Often these are generational cycles that are being repeated when it comes to trafficking. When you look at the vulnerabilities of people who are exploited and trafficked, and we're going to go into it later, you're seeing a lot of generational issues. You're seeing poverty, you're seeing sexual abuse, domestic violence. These are generational issues that are repeated and repeated and make people more and more vulnerable and susceptible to being exploited and trafficked. And so, my mother, it was a very interesting situation, because she was an army brat, as she would call herself. And her father was in the Air Force, but he wasn't like a regular Air Force person. He was actually a jazz drummer. And so they were very unique in that they were kind of like a beatnik family. He was a jazz drummer, but they were on Air Force bases, and they were always the only non-Christian family on the Air Force base. And so what happened for my mother is she was very isolated, because she was constantly moving. She was also kind of neurodivergent. She had a difficult time making friends, constantly moving. But then to add to that, because they weren't Christian, the other kids weren't allowed to play with her. The other families told their kids, don't play with Diana. She's not Christian. You can't hang out with her. And I'm not going to sugarcoat it. People who called themselves Christians failed my mother. They had an opportunity to see a family who didn't know the love of God, the mercy of God, the grace of God. And rather than saying, hey, why don't you sit at my table? Let's have a meal together. Tell me about who you are. Let me show you the love of God. Rather than doing that, they cowered away in fear that I guess my mother would be contagious. And the result was my mother ended up very, very isolated. She, like me, had a lot of sexual abuse in her history, which further led to the isolation, the shame, depression. And then eventually my grandfather ended up, leaving the Air Force and got a gig at the Stardust, which is very funny because my name is actually Harmony Stardust. My middle name is Star and my last name is Dust. But he got a gig at the Stardust in Vegas, playing as a jazz drummer. And when my mom was in Vegas as a teenager, that's when she was trafficked. And she, essentially, her story is my story. When one day I was telling my mom's story and I was talking about, the sexual abuse and how when she told her parents, they didn't believe her and they didn't protect her. And then, she was a runaway and then she was on the streets and she became susceptible to an exploiter. And as I was telling her story, I was like, oh my gosh, it's my story. It literally is my story. My story just repeated because it didn't stop with her, and it has to stop with me. And I now am standing here as the transitional generation, and I'm fighting every single day for my healing, for my health, for my wholeness, because it's not just about me, it's about my kids too. And I'm telling you, this is a generational issue. There are lives at stake, but there are also generations at stake. Every time we host a Christmas dinner, a Thanksgiving dinner with the women, who else are in the room? The children of the women. I'm watching these babies grow up, and I'm watching some of them get pulled into foster care. I'm watching some of them generational patterns repeated, right? Because I've been doing this 20 years, so I've I've now had the vantage point to see what happens over time. And I'm telling you, there is so much at stake here, not just the lives of the people, but the generations that will come from them. And the opposite is also true. When a person's life is impacted, when they are giving tools and resources to heal and to overcome and to find freedom, that impacts them, but that impacts generations, and that impacts every single person that their life impacts. It's a ripple effect, which, yeah, my mom actually wrote a poem called Ripples, and wasn't she right about it? So it didn't start with me. It started with my mother. But if I have a say about it, it is going to end with me. And I'm going to do what I can to see other women supported so that it ends with them as well. Okay, there we are. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. So I want to call to your attention a few things today. The first thing is in anti-trafficking. Okay, wait, no, here we're going to back up one page. All right, we have a slide here. Now I'm at my PowerPoint. And the slide is what's wrong with this picture. Oh, here, we are more than the trauma we have had to overcome. This is very true. We are more than the trauma we have had to overcome. Our value is beyond the trauma of our stories. In fact, our trauma is not the testimony. How we overcame the trauma is our testimony. And I think that's so important, again, especially as the anti-trafficking movement tends to elevate stories of trauma for the sake of getting eyeballs and funding and all the things. It's important for us to remember that survivors are more than the trauma that they have overcome, and that the trauma itself is not the testimony, but how we've overcome the trauma is our testimony. Okay, so I want you to take a moment and look at this picture that's up here, and just think for a moment, consider what, and you might not know the answer, and that's okay, but I just want you to consider what is wrong with this picture. How many of you have seen this exact picture before? Some of you, yep, okay. So when you Google anti-trafficking, sex trafficking victim, any kind of term like that, and you click on images, this is one of the first images that comes up, and it is accompanied by a slew of other images that look very, very similar to it. It's typically young white girls in chains that are desperately crying out for help and wanting someone to rescue them. And the reason this image is problematic is multifaceted. It does not accurately depict trafficking. So first and foremost, although there are some traffickers, and we're going to get into types of traffickers and types of tactics later, there are some traffickers that do use brute force and violence and will use like physical restraint. More often than not, the kind of manipulation that's happening is psychological, and the chains are psychological. More often than not, victims of trafficking are not walking around in shackles and chains. They're walking around to an untrained eye, seemingly completely free, but the coercion and the manipulation that happens creates psychological chains that keep them trapped in those situations. The second thing that's wrong with this is this idea that they're just helplessly waiting for you and I to come along and rescue them. This is not the case. And the word rescue has become very popular in the anti-trafficking movement. It raises a lot of money. A lot of organizations use it as a tagline and a buzzword. But the reality is we're doing a lot less rescuing than we're talking about as a movement, right? There are a lot less situations. There are not that many situations where people are busting down doors and going in and quote unquote rescuing, people out of trafficking. And even in those situations, let's say someone busts down the door, busts a trafficking ring, and rescues a girl, it's at the end of the day, that individual, or a boy or a man, I work with women, so I apologize in advance. I use a lot of terms around females because I work with women, but men and boys absolutely can be trafficked and are trafficked. Just a caveat there. So they go in, they quote unquote rescue that person. At the end of the day, it's that person that's going to do the hard work to have to continue to fight for their freedom and to resist going back to their situation of exploitation. And so I feel like we do survivors a disservice when we're constantly using the word rescuer, when really the best thing we can do is empower them and give them the tools and the support that they need to be able to overcome and find freedom from trafficking. And when we position ourselves as rescuers, it's also also disempowering to them because the power remains with the person that is the rescuer and not the person who really needs the support to be empowered. So that's the other thing. The other thing is, I think it's about 60% of, for example, domestic minor trafficking victims are African American. A very high percentage of women and girls of color are trafficked, and they are disproportionately represented as victims of trafficking, and yet they are completely underrepresented in images of trafficking because most of the images of trafficking are of young white girls. So that is what is wrong with this picture, which brings me to the idea, this kind of idea of the ideal victim. The ideal victim is a young girl who's maybe walking to school and she gets kidnapped, held at gunpoint, forced into prostitution. She escapes at her first chance. And, in other words, a weak female and consent is the lack of consent is very, very clear. But this is not what it looks like often, right? Oftentimes, like I said, the tactics are psychological. The person doesn't necessarily run at their first chance, right? They often stay trapped in it. Sometimes people will go in and quote unquote rescue people from situations of trafficking, and the person goes right back the first chance they get, right? That's very, very common. And so it's important to know that victims can be physically strong, they can be male, they can be conditioned to accept the abuse. They can be resistant to help. They can be experiencing psychological chains such as trauma bonds that keep them trapped in those situations. And what's also important is that they can be completely unaware of the fact that they're victims in the first place. That's the other reason that kind of imaging and anti-trafficking is problematic, because those of us that have experienced exploitation and trafficking are going to see an image like that, and we're going to say, if that's what trafficking looks like, then that's not me, and therefore I'm not a victim, right? Because it doesn't reflect the lived experience of most people who have been trafficked. The other thing that's important to note is that most people are trafficked not by the stranger, the kidnapper, but by people that they know, by people who are pretending to be their boyfriend, by people who are pretending to be an agent for them. You can see the graph here. So it's a very small percentage of people that are actually trafficked by a stranger. And so I think it's super important to be aware of that. We are going to skip the exploitation continuum, and we're going to go directly to, okay, so how does someone end up being vulnerable and susceptible to trafficking? So there's an interplay of individual vulnerability, which Dr. Morgan would call push factors, Sandy Morgan, and environmental factors, which would also be known as pull factors. And so oftentimes what you see in terms of vulnerability, gender plays a huge role of the majority of sex trafficking victims specifically. And again, I'm talking about sex trafficking. Just to be clear, not labor trafficking. There is a workshop today on labor trafficking, so if you're interested in learning more about that, I highly recommend you attend that. Talking about sex trafficking, the majority of people who are sex trafficked are females. Being a female of color, having been in the foster care system, about 70% of domestic minor trafficking victims are from the foster care system. That's not a coincidence, because traffickers know how to find and exploit the most vulnerable people in our society, and children in foster care are some of the most vulnerable people in our society. Having a lack of education, lack of employable job skills, maybe having mental health issues, a disability, all of these things would make someone maybe more vulnerable and susceptible to being exploited and trafficked. And then you have the environmental factors, you have the pull factors, you have the fact that we live in a culture that normalizes the sexualization and objectification of women. That's the next slide that we're looking at. We have, the normalization of male promiscuity, glamorization in the media. Is, more and more of the commercial sex industry is being glamorized in the media and kind of presented as a very viable way for a person to make money. Laws around this, there's a huge push in the United States to fully decriminalize prostitution, including pimping. Full decriminalization means you also are decriminalizing the traffickers. And a fun fact about this, the last time I spoke at a Justice Matters conference in a main session, I decided to do a talk on decriminalization and why decriminalization would be so problematic and what would happen if we actually moved towards full decriminalization, and how there's a model called the equality model that is actually a much more preferable model that would be more likely to reduce trafficking. And so I did that message here, and I ended up, it ended up becoming a TEDx talk. And so I finally released the TEDx talk. I was so excited because there was another TEDx talk that was pushing pro full decriminalization, and it had like millions of views. And so I was so excited to bring in a counter argument to the pro decriminalization conversation. And I got cyber attacked, shadow banned. People started flooding the internet with my name and TED Talk title with pornographic images. And basically they treated my talk like spam because of this, it's called spam dexing. So I didn't know all these kind of cyber attacks that happen. Anyways, unfortunately, the video was completely suppressed, and then TED banned it. So very frustrating. But I launched a website called mybannedtedtalk.com that you can go watch it there. Very, very dangerous, apparently, to tell people the truth about full decriminalization. So yeah, that was unfortunate, but that message was birthed right here in this room. All righty. And at the end of the day, regardless of whether or not a person who is working in the commercial sex industry identifies as a survivor of trafficking or not, or a victim of trafficking, 89% want to escape but see no other options for survival. And that begs the question, what is choice without options? And that's why Treasures exists, to help women find and see other options. We're going to spend a couple of minutes here going through a couple of different types of traffickers, tactics they use, the targets they have, and my hope is that you'll be a little bit more equipped in your own personal life to spot it, to know what it looks like, to understand it. And so a little bit of a trigger warning though, obviously we're talking about tactics exploiters use, and this could be maybe potentially triggering to some people, so I just want to give that as a little caveat. The first type of trafficking is, or the first type of pimp is known as a guerrilla pimp. This is the type of pimping that you often see depicted in the media, where they use brute force and violence and intimidation and threats in order to control and manipulate their victims. All exploiters are at the end of the day looking for vulnerable people, so vulnerability is always going to be at the top of the list of the target. But more specifically, the guerrilla pimp might be looking for someone with their guard down, someone that doesn't have protection. This is, there are women that Treasures has served who, did have the story of being on the streets, kidnapped by a guerrilla pimp, forced into prostitution. That absolutely does happen. Some of the lines that they might use are like, hey, come party with me, it's fine. And then, they'll drug the person and, force them into prostitution. Or they will threaten, I'll hurt you, I'll kill your family. Lots of threats and intimidations. If you don't do what I say, I'm going to send these naked photos of you that I took after I drugged you. I'm going to send them to everyone you know or post them on the internet. So lots of threats and intimidation. Those are the kind of tactics that guerrilla pimps use. What we see a lot, especially when I'm working with young people in foster care and juvenile detention centers, we see a lot of Romeo pimping. And this is the pimp that uses the promise of love and romance to manipulate victims. This is the kind of exploiter that I had. I did not recognize that I was being exploited. It took me a few years to realize that I was being pimped because I really did think of him as my boyfriend, and he definitely pitched it as many do. This is just something we'll have to do for a little while, and then we'll be able to get in, get out, and then go on and live our lives, and we'll be able to be together. This is just temporary. So, what they're looking for is vulnerable people who are looking for love, often young, naive, like I said, a lot of times runaways or youth who are in system-involved youth in foster care. And, they're making promises of love. They're, I can't live without you. You're the only one who understands me. I'm the only one who understands you. I'm the only one who will love you. So it's all, positioned around this kind of romantic relationship. The third type of pimp is a CEO pimp, and this term was coined by my dear friend Rachel Thomas, who has actually been a speaker here at the Justice Matters Conference as well. And I'm so glad that she found language to name what we see happen a lot, especially being an organization that serves people in Los Angeles. And it's the CEO pimp who uses the promise of money and business and fame and success to manipulate their victims. And so what they're looking for are aspiring models. They're looking for people who are seeking validation. They're looking for maybe college students. Hey, I have a great way for you to make a lot of money. I can help you. I'll show you the ropes. I'll be your manager. And especially in LA, they're looking for like young people who are aspiring to be in entertainment and use that kind of like as a dangling carrot to control and to manipulate and ultimately exploit people. Some of the things that they might say is, you've got what it takes. I can show you the ropes. Oh, don't worry. Like, this isn't romantic. I already have a girlfriend. This is just purely business. We're going to make money together. So that's kind of the tactic that a CEO pimp would use. And victims are recruited really from anywhere, college campuses, parties, the streets. Group homes is a big one. You see that happening a lot. Bus stops, parks, anywhere youth can be found. People can be really, really recruited from anywhere. And a big one is social media, right? Very, very common, for an exploiter to see a person maybe posting photos online and get in there and be like, oh, look at you, you're so beautiful. Have you ever thought about modeling? Or, whatever it is, like using whatever kind of tactics that they use, but using it in social media. So we see a lot of people being exploited through social media. You can look at some of these signs of trafficking. I'll put up the things. You can take a photo here, but a youth in a relationship with an older person, an adult, maybe signs of being in a domestic violence relationship. Maybe you suddenly start to see them withdraw and pull away from social relationships and after getting into a newer relationship. One of the big tactics that a lot of traffickers use is isolation. So they will systematically begin to try to make sure that that person that they want to control is severing any kind of relationship or ties with outside people, because that makes them more resilient to being exploited and more difficult to exploit. The problem here is at 47, I literally can't see my notes anymore. So, tattoos, branding, having tattoos of like dollar signs, someone's name with a crown, cream, cash rules everything around me, these kinds of like tattoos. Loyalty is a big word that we often see tattooed when it comes to those who are being victimized. Suddenly having purchasing like getting their hair and nails done, or purchasing purses and clothing and things that they don't seem like they would have the means to buy. A lot of times what traffickers will do, especially in the grooming phase, is like, get your hair done, get your nails done, and buy them stuff so that they start to think, ooh, look at this lifestyle, I want it. What do I have to do to have this lifestyle? I kind of jokingly say, for me, my exploiter, so part of my story is that my mom ended up leaving my brother and I for 3 months with $20 and a book of food stamps. And so I was like stealing from the liquor store to feed my brother and I. And that is when I really became more deeply involved with the boy in my neighborhood who ultimately became my exploiter. And when he was around, he would take us to Burger King. And I was a vegetarian at the time, so I would get a cheeseburger with no meat, which they thought it was crazy because in the 80s and 90s, like nobody was a vegetarian. But anyways, cheeseburger with no meat. So I joke around like he literally bought me Burger King. And that was like the extent of grooming it took for me. And I thought he hung the moon and he was my knight in shining armor. That's how vulnerable I was. I didn't even get my hair and nails done. Okay, it's a joke. We can, okay. Sorry. maybe the wrong audience for that joke, but if I was with my survivor sisters, they'd have been laughing. So if they begin dressing in a way that's more sexualized, maybe start ditching school. So you just start seeing those changes. Again, you can take photos of those slides. But at the end of the day, what I want to really leave you with is the hope piece. And it's the reality that just as much as, when I don't know about you, even when I talk about and think about like the vulnerability slide and all of the environmental factors, and you think about like how many obstacles a person is facing when they're wanting to rebuild their lives after having experienced exploitation and trafficking, that many of us are coming from histories of complex trauma, are coming from generational cycles of poverty and abuse, and are, don't have stuff to put on our resume, and then have to find a way to fight for our own healing while rebuilding our lives and finding a new way of making income and dealing with the isolation you feel when you've left it all behind and you don't have new social relationships to lean on. It is overwhelming and it is daunting. And at the same time, I do know that you and I have the opportunity to be a positive environmental factor. You and I, just the same way as all these negative environmental factors are happening, you and I have an opportunity to be a positive environmental factor. As neighbors, as friends, as people, social workers, teachers, like wherever your sphere of influence is, I guarantee there are opportunities around you. I guarantee there are. I guarantee if you open your eyes, there are people in your world, and maybe they're a little messy, and maybe it would get a little messy, but maybe there's someone that you can invite to your dinner table. Maybe there's someone like my mom who just needed a lifeline. And ultimately, the reason I'm standing here today, the reason I am alive today, is someone did that for me. That is why I'm alive today, is that a person, and she didn't have a master's degree or run a nonprofit. She was a 20-something-year-old college student who just made a decision to show me the unconditional love of God and invite me to eat frozen yogurt. And just was kind and loved me where I was at. And when I would open up a little bit, and we do little trickle truths, we give them a little trickle of the truth, see how they react, right? Like, I'd give her a little little tidbit, and I'm looking and I'm watching. Is she gonna judge me? She didn't. Okay, I can trust her, I can tell her a little bit more. And slowly and gradually, I could open up and share more about my life. And in doing so, she had the opportunity to speak into my life, and she had the opportunity to influence my life. And it's her friendship and her willingness to be in my life is why I'm standing here today. And I guarantee you, if you pause and pray and ask God, I guarantee you there are probably people in your life who could use a text, how you doing, been thinking about you, or hey, do you want to have coffee? Would you like to come for dinner, right? And I would encourage you to think about what is in your hand and how can you get involved. We need your help. We need your help. The anti-trafficking movement is not going to be able, can't move forward without the support of people and community like you. It can't happen. We absolutely rely, especially as nonprofits, we rely on our volunteers, we rely on our donors, we rely on, churches who support us. It's the only way we continue to do the work and move the needle forward, is if people like you in this room are willing to say, okay, let me think about what I can do, given my context, my circumstances, my time, talent, treasure, right? What do I have? What's in my hand? And I would encourage you to think about maybe even something small could be become a monthly partner with one of the nonprofits that are here today. The nonprofits that are here at the fair today have been vetted by Kelly. You can assume that they are trustworthy. It doesn't have to be Treasures. If it's Treasures, that's great, but think about, walk around, check out the booths and see if there's one out there that resonates with you. And the reason becoming a monthly partner is so important is because we need people who are willing to really stand by our sides as NGOs and sustain the work with us. So even if it's $10 a month, that means a lot. We rely on the generosity of individual people to support the work that we do. I encourage you, if you have time, think go out there and see if there's one that maybe you want to volunteer with, that maybe there's a way you have a skill set that would be a good fit and a good match for one of the nonprofits represented out there. Go to one of the workshops, further educate yourself, equip yourself, learn more about it. But I encourage you to think about, before you run to your car and go about your wonderful day that you're about to have, really think about, what's one thing I can do today? Maybe if it's even just signing up for the newsletter of one of the nonprofits, just to start getting information about what they're up to and start getting communication and start learning more, right? Like, it can be so small, but I encourage you to do something. Take action today, because we need you. We need you. There are lives at stake and there are generations at stake. Thank you.